I want to spend a little time unpacking what one might call emotional healing work, trauma work, that type of thing that happenings during an awakening process. And in doing so, I guess clarify a little bit at least about what, I can only speak from the experience here, but at least what I have come to understand in my own unfolding and going through this. But emotions can be, or they have been for me, they've been a really interesting thing to kind of approach and tackle. And, especially because there's two, I've talked about this in previous videos, but there's two movements of awakening. There's a transcendent movement, which is the realizing that I am not this body, I do not exist, I am not this mind, these emotions aren't real, things of that nature. And that's a really comfortable place to stay, especially for those of us that have a lot of emotional baggage, or what you might call trauma, for individuals who have had a difficult life in various ways. It can be really comfortable to stay in that place of transcendence and to avoid, that stage is necessary, but it can be easy to get stuck there as a way to kind of bypass any sort of emotional discomfort, or kind of unpacking the ways that there's still stuckness in the physical body, because the ways that emotions get stuck. So in this like relative body, you are not this body, but there is a body that is a function and aspect of life that is expressing. And it's correct to say that there's not a someone here who is expressing as this thing, but in the process of an ego being formed, there are ways that this body, this animal, gets conditioned, and energies end up getting stuck in the body. And those energies need to, those ways of conditioning, those egoic tendencies that kind of manifest physically, end up getting stuck and need to be seen through and seen in their own falseness. They need to understand their own falseness in order for them to let go. And from one perspective, not everybody's going to have to go through this. Not everybody is going to need to do this type of work. It's not going to be something that resonates, that makes sense for every individual who's going through this and going through a process of like a disidentification and a dissolution of the notion of a self and like a separate individual. But then for some like me, these things are going to be necessary, and the transcendence was simply a way to bypass that stuckness. And so the way that I've kind of come to think about emotions is interesting, because I think when I was going through that transcendent stage, there was something in me that was very dismissive of any psychology, any type of healing work, anything that, was really confronting towards that type of thing, because there was this idea that like, that's not real, that doesn't exist, therefore it doesn't need to be looked at. But ultimately, every energy is an expression of that which you are. And energies arise as sensations in the body. And when there is conditioning involved, essentially what happens is that those energies meet blocks or things that prevent them from moving up and out. So energy wants to move. Energy comes in, as arises as a sensation, or you can call that an emotion, and then naturally what it will do when it's unimpeded is going to move through and out as some sort of expression. But when conditioning comes online and an ego is in place, what happens is there becomes this kind of categorization that this thing is bad, this thing is good, this thing is right, this thing is wrong, this thing gets suppressed, this thing gets expressed, and there's an unconsciousness behind that. So when energies get stifled, those energies get stuck in the body, and it manifests like it seems, at least for me, that most beliefs have some sort of an associated blockage in the physical body, because that conditioning didn't allow those things to move through. So then there's a belief that gets formed around it, and it becomes really difficult to separate those things. So a conversation that Henry and I were having recently was around emotions, because I think as humans, kind of operating from a very highly egoic level, we have this, there's this confusion, or maybe just like a misunderstanding about what an emotion is, because we have so much concept wrapped up in, say an emotion or a word like anger or a word like grief. There's like this unconscious association of bad, needs to be suppressed, is always, take anger for instance, is always expressed in a out of control way. And those are conditions and beliefs that get those associations happen through childhood, but those things are not true. So essentially, what this process of awakening is starting to see those unconscious associations and to disidentify. So essentially, you could say like a raw emotion is simply sensation in the body. So anger is simply sensation, physical sensation in the body. And the ego, as it's formed, attaches concepts and stories and labels to that. And then the identity kind of gets built around that. So for some individuals like myself, the conditioning here was that anger is bad. Anger is always expressed in an out of control way. Anger is not safe to be around. And therefore anger is not safe to express, because it is unsafe, it is out of control, it is rageful, it is violent, it's not safe. But those are the constructs around it. But the physical sensation is the reality of it. So the delusion is the story that we attach, the stories and the beliefs that get attached to the emotion. Whereas the raw physical emotion, the sensation, is reality. And that sensation is information. So it's the body getting information from the external environment, and then it, when we're able to see it clearly, it's giving us information. So like anger, if it's not indulged in, so if we don't let it sweep us away, and if it's not suppressed, is giving information about perhaps a boundary that needs to be set. And this stuff does not, I understand, like this stuff does not sound spiritual, it does not sound esoteric, it does not sound mystical. This is like the nuts and bolts of where unconsciousness is occurring day to day to day to day, moment to moment to moment to moment. And that transcendent place is very necessary for this embodiment movement, because there can be enough separation where there's a disidentification from these things, which then makes it easier to then come back in and inspect them from a place where there's an understanding that I am not this. So whereas maybe like a more traditional healing model might be to do something like shadow work or emotional work or trauma work as a way to make myself better, the perspective when it's happening during an awakening is not to make myself better, because there's an understanding that there is no self to improve. It's simply going in and shining a light on the places where there is still stuckness, the places where energies, the physical raw energies have not been liberated, or the energies themselves have been liberated, but the belief, there's an associated belief that gets stuck, and that energy is not able to be liberated. So it's going back in, it's taking that what was gained through that transcendent movement, and then going back in and applying it practically. So on a moment by moment by moment basis, as there is a sensation arising in the body, there's no longer an identification with it. Because an identification, even if you're just saying, that's not true, it's not true, therefore I should ignore it, that is suppression, that is repression, that is unconsciousness. Even though it feels like it's not, it is. And I've gotten stuck in that. And getting swept up in it is indulging it, and that is also unconscious. So the liberation, as I talked about in my previous video, is finding that middle ground of neutrality where the raw emotion itself is simply felt, and there's a disidentification from the stories surrounding it. So essentially what happens is the ego and the raw sensation that is occurring moment by moment in reality. So the reality of it, which is the sensation, and the egoic component, which is the story and the identity, start to become separated. But when we're living in an egoic place, those things, emotions and stories and conditioning, are so intertwined that we're not able to see that they're actually two separate things. We believe that our emotions are reality, or that our emotions, which at that point is wrapped up in story, in egoic unconscious behaviors, are one and the same. But as we begin to wake up, we realize that they're actually two separate things. So we start to be able to pull them apart and see what is reality and what is delusion, and start to see that delusion for what it is, and in doing so, liberate the delusion, come to live in reality by identifying what is happening in reality in a moment, which is this sensation is arising, and allowing it to express as it wants to express, remaining conscious throughout the whole process, and completely conscious, not allowing it to get swept away by a story, even though there might be that tug. And so in that way, talking about emotions, and I know when I was going through, like the transcendent stage, I was very turned off by emotional stuff, because I was just like, oh, that's bullshit, that doesn't exist, that's not real. But then it's interesting, and I can understand why teachers kind of stray or tread cautiously when it comes to emotional stuff, because when we are still very much living primarily from an egoic place, the emotional stuff can be a way to continue to feed the ego, to try to make myself better, and it makes us think that we're going somewhere when in actuality we're staying, comfortably spinning in place, without actually any movement happening. So I understand why there's some people that talk about these types of things like non-duality and things like that are very focused on, uncompromising message, and it gets one to that transcendent place, but then there's an entirely different movement that happens after that, which is coming to liberate all of those places where stuckness and unconsciousness are still residing. And a lot of that has to do with investigating really honestly and really openly emotions, sensations, and learning to separate reality from our delusions of reality. Hopefully that's helpful. It's been a hard process for me. It's been very humbling. It's been very challenging. But that distinction, as I've come to it, has been very transformative for me as I've been moving through this, and has really helped me to start to be able to discern what is reality from what are places where my ego is still holding on and still creating delusion.